Commander Zekth watched the human ship approach through the main viewing screen of his vessel. The ISV Harmony was one of the finest diplomatic cruisers in the Catherian fleet, but the human ship looked nothing like the elegant curves and flowing lines that marked civilized starship design. The USS Liberty was all sharp angles and brutal efficiency, with weapons that seemed too large for its frame and armor, that looked like it was meant for war rather than exploration. The humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years. Ego and their technology showed it. Where Catherian ships used quantum field manipulation and gravitic drives, the human vessel relied on crude fusion rockets and primitive jump drives that left energy signatures visible from 3 star systems away. Zekth's science officer had commented that human engineering reminded him of clubs rather than tools, but clubs that somehow worked better than they had any right to. Admiral Jake Morrison was the first human to step aboard the Harmony, and Zekth immediately noticed something wrong about the way he moved. Most species walked with the casual confidence of beings who had evolved past the need for constant vigilance. But Morrison's eyes swept the docking bay like he was cataloging every exit and every potential threat. His handshake was firm enough to be painful, and his smile never quite reached those calculating gray eyes. Dr. Lisa Grant accompanied the Admiral, and she seemed more normal at first glance. She wore the loose robes favored by most galactic scientists and carried data tablets instead of weapons, but there was something in the way she examined the Harmony's bulkheads that reminded Zekth of a predator studying the walls of a cage. When she asked technical questions about the ship's construction, her interest seemed less academic and more practical. The formal meeting took place in the Harmony's main conference room with representatives from 6 different species present to observe this first official contact with humanity. The humans presented gifts as was traditional, including samples of their art and music, along with basic technological exchanges. Morrison spoke eloquently about humanity's desire to join the galactic community and contribute to the peace that had existed between civilized worlds for over 2,000 years. Zekth began explaining the standard procedures for newly contacted species. There were protocols to follow and careful steps designed to integrate primitive civilizations into galactic society without causing cultural shock or technological disruption. New species typically spent several decades as junior partners, learning from more advanced races before being granted full membership in the Galactic Council. Morrison listened politely as Zekth described how human ships would serve alongside experienced crews and how human colonies would receive guidance from established worlds. The Admiral nodded at appropriate moments and asked thoughtful questions about trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. But something in his expression began to change as the meeting continued. When Zekth mentioned that human military forces would operate under Catherian command structure until they demonstrated sufficient understanding of galactic warfare principles, Morrison's smile became something else entirely. It was still polite and diplomatic, but there was an edge to it that made Zekth's scales prickle with unease. Dr. Grant had stopped taking notes and was studying the assembled alien delegates with the same intensity she had shown toward the ship's construction. The meeting concluded without incident, but as the humans prepared to return to their vessel, Morrison made a comment that stayed with Zekth long after the Liberty had departed. The Admiral thanked him for the information about galactic protocols and mentioned that humanity looked forward to learning everything they could about how civilized species conducted warfare. The way he said civilized made it sound like he was talking about an interesting but ultimately irrelevant curiosity. Later that evening, Zekth reviewed the recordings of the meeting with his senior staff. His tactical officer pointed out that the humans had asked very specific questions about fleet compositions and defensive strategies while showing little interest in cultural or scientific exchanges. His science officer noted that human technology might be primitive, but it showed clear signs of being designed for conflict rather than exploration. The most disturbing observation came from his communications specialist, who had been monitoring human transmissions during their visit. The humans maintained constant contact with their home fleet using encryption that was surprisingly sophisticated for such a young civilization. More troubling was the fact that they had somehow mapped the Harmony's internal systems within minutes of boarding. Despite having no prior exposure to Catherian technology, Zeketh found himself thinking about Morrison's eyes and the way both humans had moved through his ship like they were already planning how to take it apart. He had welcomed thousands of new species into the galactic community over his long career and had seen every type of reaction from desperate gratitude to arrogant dismissal, but he had never encountered anything quite like humanity's quiet confidence. Official reports would describe the first contact as successful and recommend proceeding with standard integration protocols, but Zeketh added a personal note to his files. Something about these humans felt different, and not in ways that made him comfortable. They had the courtesy of diplomats, but the eyes of soldiers and their questions suggested they were preparing for something far more serious than peaceful cooperation as he prepared his final report. Zeketh couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy had just made contact with something that would change everything, but whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. 3 weeks after first contact, the universe changed forever, and Captain Ryan Cooper was the first human to see it happen. He was leading a joint patrol with Commander Zeketh when the long-range sensors began screaming warnings that should have been impossible. Massive energy signatures were emerging from the dark space between galaxies, and they were moving toward inhabited systems with deliberate purpose. The readings made no sense according to every known law of physics. The energy outputs were larger than entire star systems, and the propulsion signatures suggested vessels that were impossibly vast. Zeketh's communications officer began receiving distress calls from monitoring stations across 17 different star systems, all reporting the same terrifying readings. Cooper studied the sensor data with the calm focus that Zeketh had come to associate with humans and asked questions that revealed an understanding of military tactics that seemed far too advanced for such a young species. While Zeketh's crew began standard evacuation procedures, Cooper was already plotting intercept courses and calculating response times for fleet deployments. The first visual confirmation came from a deep space observatory near the galactic rim. The images showed ships that defied comprehension with hulls that stretched for hundreds of kilometers and weapon systems that could crack planets. They moved in perfect formation like a school of predatory fish, and their design spoke of technology that was ancient beyond measure. Zeketh recognized them from historical records that most civilized species preferred to forget. The Void Hunters had appeared once before 10,000 years ago and had nearly exterminated all sapient life in the galaxy before vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. They were machines built by some long-dead race and driven by purposes that no living being could understand. The historical accounts described their standard tactics with clinical precision. They would arrive in a system and begin harvesting everything of value, from planets to asteroids to the star itself. Any resistance was crushed with overwhelming force, and entire civilizations were processed into raw materials to fuel their incomprehensible mission. They showed no interest in negotiation or communication and treated all organic life as nothing more than inefficient resource allocation. Cooper listened to Zeketh's explanation of the historical records and asked Lieutenant Amy Brooks to analyze the tactical data. Brooks was humanity's liaison officer, and Zeketh had initially dismissed her as a young officer gaining experience in diplomatic missions, but her questions about Void Hunter capabilities revealed a mind that understood warfare in ways that made him uncomfortable. As reports continued to flood in from the outer colonies, Brooks began constructing a three-dimensional tactical display that showed Void Hunter movements with disturbing accuracy. She identified their probable targets and predicted their advance routes, while Cooper coordinated with Admiral Morrison back on Earth. The humans were not panicking or preparing for evacuation like every other species in the galaxy. Instead, they were asking technical questions about Void Hunter weaknesses and requesting detailed scans of their ship configurations. Brooks wanted to know about their shield frequencies and weapon charging cycles, while Cooper was calculating the minimum force required to damage their hulls. They spoke about the ancient machines like they were solving an engineering problem, rather than facing an extinction-level threat. The first battle reports arrived 6 hours later from the Kepler mining colony, where a small Void Hunter advance force had encountered local defense platforms. The results were exactly what historical records predicted, with the machines systematically destroying every trace of civilization before beginning their harvesting operations. What surprised Zeketh was Cooper's reaction to the tactical footage, where any sane being would see overwhelming enemy superiority. Cooper saw opportunities and weaknesses. He pointed out that Void Hunter ships were designed for fighting primitive civilizations, and their tactics had not evolved in 10,000 years. Their formation flying was perfect but predictable, and their weapon systems were optimized for destroying static targets rather than mobile threats. Brooks had been monitoring communication frequencies during the attack and discovered that Void Hunter ships coordinated through quantum entanglement networks that operated faster than light, but were vulnerable to specific types of interference. She also noted that their harvesting equipment created temporary weak points in their armor that could be exploited by fast-moving attackers. The Galactic Defense Fleet was mobilizing according to established protocols, with each species contributing their most advanced vessels to form massive defensive formations around critical systems. The strategy was based on lessons learned from the previous Void Hunter incursion and emphasized protecting civilian populations while trading space for time. Cooper reviewed the defensive plans and made suggestions that horrified Zeketh with their implications. Instead of forming static defensive lines, the humans recommended using small, fast attack groups to harass Void Hunter supply lines and communication networks. They proposed targeting the machines during their most vulnerable harvesting phases and using hit-and-run tactics to disrupt their systematic advance. The human strategy violated every principle of civilized warfare because it assumed that military forces would deliberately seek out combat rather than avoiding it whenever possible. Cooper spoke about acceptable loss ratios and tactical sacrifices with the same casual tone that most officers used to discuss supply requisitions. When Admiral Morrison arrived with the main human fleet, Zeketh was shocked by what he saw. Human ships were smaller than most galactic standard vessels, but they moved with an agility that seemed to defy physics. Their weapon systems were crude but powerful, and their crews operated with a coordination that reminded him of pack hunters, rather than military personnel. The humans had been part of galactic civilization for less than a month, but they were already proposing strategies that would revolutionize how the combined fleets fought against the Void Hunters. Morrison requested permission to implement experimental tactics, using human ships as forward scouts and strike teams, while the main galactic fleet provided heavy support. Zeketh found himself caught between admiration and terror as he watched the humans prepare for war against an enemy that had once nearly destroyed all life in the galaxy. They showed no fear of the ancient machines and seemed genuinely excited about the tactical challenges ahead. Whatever humanity was, it was definitely not another civilized species seeking peaceful integration into galactic society. The first major battle took place at Kepler Station, and Commander Zeketh volunteered to lead the evacuation of human civilians, expecting to find the usual panic and chaos that accompanied Void Hunter attacks. Instead, he discovered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about how intelligent species responded to existential threats. Kepler Station was humanity's primary research outpost in the Outer Rim and home to 15,000 human civilians, including families with children who had never seen combat. Standard evacuation procedures called for removing all non-essential personnel within 6 hours of confirmed Void Hunter approach. But when Zeketh arrived, he found that the humans had made different plans. Dr. Lisa Grant met him at the docking bay. But she was no longer the polite scientist from their diplomatic meetings. She wore improvised combat armor constructed from mining equipment and carried weapons that Zeketh didn't recognize. Behind her, human civilians moved through the station corridors with purpose, rather than panic, and even the children seemed to understand their roles in whatever the adults were planning. Grant explained that the civilian population had voted to remain and fight rather than abandon their homes to the Void Hunters. Zekth tried to explain that civilians could not stand against ancient war machines that had destroyed entire civilizations, but Grant just smiled and said that humans had different ideas about what civilians could do when properly motivated. The station's mining equipment had been converted into weapons, with plasma cutters becoming directed energy weapons and ore processing units being turned into explosive devices. The humans had spent 3 days turning their peaceful research facility into something that looked like a fortress designed by insane engineers who understood both construction and destruction in equal measure. Zeketh watched in growing horror as human families worked together to install improvised weapon systems while their children carried ammunition and helped with basic maintenance tasks. The humans treated preparation for battle like any other community project, with parents teaching their offspring how to operate emergency systems and elderly researchers sharing their knowledge of station layouts with younger fighters. When the Void Hunter vessels finally arrived, Zeketh expected the usual systematic destruction that marked their attacks on civilian targets. The ancient machines deployed boarding pods with mechanical precision and sent waves of harvester units into the station, expecting to encounter helpless prey that would be quickly processed. Instead, they found humans who had prepared for their arrival with careful planning and ruthless efficiency. The station's corridors had been turned into killing zones with concealed weapons and improvised traps that activated when the machines reached predetermined positions. Every room became a fortress, and every hallway became a battlefield. The humans fought with a coordination that seemed impossible for beings who had no military training. Civilian engineers operated heavy weapons, while research scientists provided tactical support, and even children served as runners carrying supplies and information between fighting positions. They moved through their own station like they owned every corridor and knew every weakness in their enemy's approach. What disturbed Zekth most was how the humans adapted their tactics in real time as they learned about Void Hunter capabilities. When direct weapons fire proved insufficient, they switched to using the station's industrial systems as weapons. When the machines adapted to their traps, they began using mobility and surprise to stay ahead of their enemies' learning algorithms. The battle lasted 18 hours, and when galactic reinforcements finally arrived, they found Kepler Station still under human control. The corridors were filled with the wreckage of Void Hunter machines, and the humans were already beginning salvage operations to learn more about their enemy's technology. The civilian casualties were lighter than any military planner would have predicted. Dr. Grant briefed the arriving fleet commanders on what they had learned about Void Hunter tactics and weaknesses, but her report read like a dissection rather than a battle analysis. The humans had systematically tested their enemy's capabilities and identified exploitable flaws while fighting for their lives. They treated combat like a science experiment with lethal consequences. Admiral Morrison arrived with the main human fleet and immediately began implementing lessons learned from the Kepler battle across all human forces. The civilian defenders were not evacuated, but instead were reinforced and supplied with better equipment. The humans intended to use their research station as a forward base for further operations against the Void Hunters. Zekth realized that he had fundamentally misunderstood what humanity represented. These were not peaceful civilians who had been forced into combat by circumstances beyond their control. They were predators who had been temporarily disguised as researchers and miners and engineers. When threatened, they had simply revealed their true nature. The human children who had helped carry ammunition during the battle were now playing games that involved tactical planning and resource management. The elderly researchers who had shared technical knowledge were designing new weapons based on salvaged Void Hunter technology. The families who had fought together were planning their next engagement with the enthusiasm of people who had discovered their true calling. The Galactic Fleet commanders held emergency meetings to discuss what had happened at Kepler Station and the implications for their understanding of human capabilities. Some argued that humanity's performance was an anomaly caused by desperation and favorable circumstances, but others were beginning to suspect that something more fundamental was at work. Zekth filed his own report, but struggled to find words that could adequately describe what he had witnessed. How could he explain that human civilians had fought ancient war machines to a standstill using improvised weapons and tactical coordination that surpassed most military units? How could he convey that the humans had seemed to enjoy the challenge rather than simply endure it? The official records would describe the defense of Kepler Station as a heroic last stand by determined civilians, but Zeketh knew the truth was more disturbing. The humans had not made a desperate last stand against overwhelming odds. They had set a trap for the Void Hunters and then systematically dismantled them while learning everything they could about how to kill them more efficiently. As he prepared to leave Kepler Station, Zeketh found himself wondering what would happen when humanity finished learning about their new enemy and began teaching the rest of the galaxy what they had discovered. The war that followed the battle at Kepler Station revealed humanity's true nature to the galaxy in ways that made every other species profoundly uncomfortable. While the combined galactic fleet formed defensive lines around critical systems and prepared for the siege warfare that historical records suggested the humans did something unprecedented. They went hunting. Commander Zekth found himself assigned to a joint task force under Captain Steve Martinez, and quickly learned that human military doctrine bore no resemblance to anything in the galactic tactical databases. Where civilized species fought defensive wars designed to minimize casualties and protect civilian populations, the humans approached combat like persistence, predators stalking prey across vast distances. Martinez was a quiet man with steady hands and eyes that never stopped moving, but his tactical briefings revealed a mind that understood warfare in ways that made Zeketh deeply uneasy. Human strategy did not focus on defending fixed positions or controlling territory. Instead, they identified Void Hunter weaknesses and then systematically exploited them regardless of conventional military wisdom. The human fleet was organized into small independent squadrons that could operate without support for extended periods. Their ships were fast and maneuverable with minimal armor but maximum firepower, and each crew was cross-trained to handle multiple mission types. They moved through space like wolf packs hunting in coordinated groups. Lieutenant Amy Brooks served as tactical coordinator for the joint operations, and her briefings were masterclasses in predatory thinking. She had identified patterns in Void Hunter behavior that no one else had noticed and developed countermeasures that turned the machine's own strengths against them. The ancient vessels were powerful but predictable, and their tactical responses followed algorithms that could be manipulated. The humans began by attacking Void Hunter supply lines that the machines didn't even know they had. Ancient harvesters would strip entire star systems of useful materials before moving on to the next target, but they needed to process and transport those resources back to their main fleet. Human squadrons would wait in hyperspace along those transport routes and strike without warning. Martinez explained that Void Hunter logistics were based on perfect efficiency and mathematical precision, which made them vulnerable to chaos and unpredictability. Human attacks were deliberately random and seemingly senseless, but they created cascade failures in machine planning algorithms that had operated flawlessly for 10,000 years. The first successful raid took place near the Vega system, where a human squadron intercepted a Void Hunter transport convoy carrying processed materials from 3 different harvesting operations. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but destroyed cargo that had taken the machines weeks to collect and forced them to delay their advance toward populated systems. Brooks analyzed the wreckage and discovered that Void Hunter ships used quantum computational networks that could be disrupted by specific electromagnetic frequencies. The humans began developing specialized weapons that could cause critical system failures in machine vessels during combat. They shared this information with their galactic allies, but kept the most effective countermeasures for their own use. The pattern continued across dozens of star systems, with human squadrons appearing where they were least expected and striking at targets that seemed militarily insignificant. They destroyed communication relays and sensor platforms and automated repair facilities that the Void Hunters had built during their previous incursion 10,000 years ago. What disturbed Zekth most was how the humans coordinated their scattered operations without any central command structure. Each squadron operated independently, but their attacks were perfectly timed to support overall strategic objectives. They shared intelligence instantly and adapted their tactics in real time like a single distributed organism during the battle. Of Proxima Defense Grid, Zekth finally understood what made human warfare so effective and so terrifying. The Void Hunters had deployed overwhelming force to crush the combined galactic fleet, but found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to behave according to established tactical principles. Human ships didn't fight in formation like civilized vessels. Instead, they moved through the battlefield like individual predators working together to bring down larger prey. They would coordinate attacks on specific targets, then scatter before the machines could respond, only to regroup and strike again. From a completely different direction, Lieutenant Brooks coordinated the human response from her position on Martinez's flagship, but she wasn't giving orders in any conventional sense. Instead, she was sharing information and suggestions that each squadron commander could interpret and implement according to local conditions. The humans fought like they were all part of the same pack, even when separated by millions of kilometers. The battle lasted 6 hours and ended with the Void Hunter fleet retreating for the first time in recorded history. The machines had lost more ships than in any previous engagement, and their tactical algorithms had been so disrupted that they were making planning errors that cascaded through their entire operational structure. Zekth reviewed the battle recordings and realized that he was watching something that had never existed before in galactic history. The humans weren't just another species that had learned to fight. They were apex predators who had evolved specifically to hunt and kill things that were bigger and stronger than themselves. Captain Martinez filed his after-action report with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything the humans did, but the implications were staggering. Human tactics were based on the assumption that any enemy could be defeated if you understood their behavior patterns and exploited their weaknesses with sufficient persistence and coordination. The galactic military establishment struggled to understand what they were seeing. Human losses were actually lower than traditional fleet actions, despite their aggressive tactics, and their operational tempo was far higher than any civilized military could sustain. They seemed to thrive on the chaos and uncertainty that made other species retreat to defensive positions. As Zeketh prepared his own report, he found himself wondering what would happen when the war was over and these human predators no longer had ancient machines to hunt. The galaxy had gained powerful allies in the fight against the Void Hunters, but it might have also unleashed something far more dangerous than anyone realized. The final confrontation with the Void Hunters came at the edge of known space, where the ancient machines had established their primary staging area for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the galactic core, the combined fleet that assembled. To face them was the largest military force in recorded history, with hundreds of ships from dozens of species, all united against an enemy that threatened to extinguish all organic life. Commander Zeketh stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, which served as Admiral Jake Morrison's flagship for the assault, and watched as humanity prepared to reveal the full extent of their capabilities. The battle plan was entirely human in design and required a level of coordination and risk acceptance that made every other species' military advisors profoundly uncomfortable. The Void Hunter staging area was a massive construction that stretched across an entire star system with harvesting facilities and manufacturing plants and weapon platforms that could destroy entire fleets. The machines had built their fortress over the course of several months, using materials stripped from a dozen dead civilizations, and it represented their accumulated technological superiority over 10,000 years. Morrison's plan called for A multi-pronged assault that would require precise timing and absolute commitment from every participating vessel. The Galactic fleet would provide heavy fire support and serve as a defensive screen, while human squadrons penetrated the Void Hunter perimeter and struck at critical infrastructure targets. It was ambitious to the point of insanity and depended entirely on human tactical innovations. As the battle began, Zeketh watched his galactic allies fight with the desperate courage that characterized civilized beings defending their homes and families. Cytherian ships used their superior shields to absorb punishment while closing to effective weapons range. Veltar vessels deployed their advanced energy weapons in coordinated volleys designed to overwhelm enemy defenses. Nordak heavy cruisers contributed their massive armor and firepower to anchor the battle line. It was impressive and coordinated and ultimately insufficient against an enemy that had been designed to fight exactly this type of conventional engagement. The Void Hunters responded with mathematical precision and overwhelming firepower that began systematically dismantling the galactic formation. Their weapons were calibrated to exploit every known weakness in Allied ship design, and their tactics were optimized for fighting multiple species simultaneously. Then the humans showed what they had been preparing for throughout the entire war, and Zeketh realized that everything he had witnessed before had been merely preliminary testing. What he had mistaken for individual courage and tactical innovation was revealed as something far more systematic and terrifying. Every human ship and every human crew and every human civilian who had volunteered for the mission operated as components of a vast, interconnected network that transcended individual survival instincts. They anticipated each other's movements and compensated for each other's weaknesses, and struck with a unity that made their previous coordination look primitive by comparison. Human squadrons moved through the Void Hunter fortress like antibodies, attacking an infection with each group targeting specific systems that would create cascade failures throughout the machine network. They identified vulnerabilities that shouldn't have existed and exploited weaknesses that required perfect timing and absolute synchronization to reach. Lieutenant Amy Brooks coordinated the assault from the Defiance, but her role was more like a conductor directing an orchestra than a commander giving orders. The human ships responded to her guidance with an efficiency that bordered on telepathic, and their attacks were timed to create maximum disruption in enemy operations. The humans had spent months learning how Void Hunter systems functioned and had developed countermeasures that turned the machine's own efficiency against them. They triggered controlled overloads in power distribution networks and introduced viruses into computational systems and caused structural failures in critical support systems. Captain Steve Martinez led the deepest penetration mission with a squadron of volunteer crews who knew they were unlikely to survive the assault. Their target was the Central Command facility that coordinated all Void Hunter operations, and destroying it would leave the individual machine ships vulnerable to conventional attacks. Zeketh watched through real-time sensor feeds as Martinez's squadron fought their way through layers of automated defenses while human engineers aboard his own ship provided technical support and tactical analysis. The humans treated the mission like a complex engineering problem with acceptable loss ratios and statistical probabilities rather than a desperate military operation. The breakthrough came when human specialists discovered that Void Hunter Command systems were vulnerable to a specific type of quantum interference that could only be generated by deliberately overloading human ship power cores. The technique required crews to sacrifice their vessels and their lives, but would create a cascade failure that would disable the entire machine network. Morrison made the decision without consulting his galactic allies and gave the order that condemned hundreds of human crews to certain death. The response was immediate acceptance and professional acknowledgement with no protests or hesitation from the volunteers who would implement the plan. The final assault lasted 37 minutes and ended with the complete destruction of the Void Hunter staging area along with most of their accumulated technological resources. The ancient machines' tactical algorithms had been so thoroughly disrupted that their remaining forces began attacking each other in confusion, while human survivors systematically hunted down the scattered remnants. When the last Void Hunter vessel went dark, the galaxy had been saved, but at a cost that made every other species reevaluate everything they thought they knew about warfare and survival. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that made their previous achievements look like training exercises. Zekth realized that the galactic community had not been saved by its most advanced or most civilized members. They had been saved by Apex, predators who had evolved specifically to hunt and kill things that were bigger and stronger and more dangerous than themselves. The humans had faced an extinction-level threat and responded by becoming something even more terrifying. The war was over, but its implications were just beginning. Humanity had proven they could be trusted as allies, but they had also revealed capabilities that made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The question was no longer whether they could defend civilization, but whether civilization could survive having them as neighbors. In the months following the war, Commander Zeketh found himself serving as primary liaison between the Galactic Council and Earth's military command, while the political landscape shifted in ways that no one had anticipated. Where once humanity had been considered a junior species requiring careful guidance and integration, they were now the subject of nervous diplomatic maneuvering and barely concealed fear from civilizations that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. The other species had witnessed what humans were capable of when facing an existential threat, and the recordings of their performance against the Void Hunters had been studied by every military academy and strategic planning committee in known space. What they saw challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence and civilization, and the relationship between technological advancement and combat effectiveness. Human tactical innovations were being adopted by species that had perfected their military doctrines over thousands of years, but the underlying philosophy behind those innovations remained alien and disturbing to minds that had evolved past the need for predatory behavior. The humans fought like they were designed for killing rather than survival, and their casual acceptance of casualties would have been considered pathological in any other species. Dr. Lisa Grant had been appointed as humanity's chief scientific liaison, and her research into Void Hunter technology was producing advances that leapfrogged entire fields of study. Human scientists approached the ancient machines' remains with the same systematic efficiency they had shown during combat, and their discoveries were revolutionizing everything from quantum computing to materials science. What made the galactic scientific community uncomfortable was how quickly the humans integrated captured technology into their own systems. Where other species would spend decades carefully studying alien innovations to understand their underlying principles, humans simply reverse-engineered what they needed and improved upon the original designs. They treated advanced technology like tools to be used, rather than mysteries to be contemplated. Captain Steve Martinez had been promoted to head Earth's Joint Operations Command, and his strategic planning sessions were attended by military observers from every major galactic power. The humans were sharing their tactical innovations freely, but their willingness to cooperate only made their capabilities more obvious to potential rivals who were beginning to calculate whether humanity represented an opportunity or a threat. Human fleet was expanding rapidly, using manufacturing techniques derived from Void Hunter technology, and their ship designs were becoming more sophisticated while retaining the aggressive characteristics that had made them so effective during the war. Human vessels were still smaller than galactic standard, but they were faster and more heavily armed, and their crews operated with the same pack coordination that had proven so devastating against ancient machines. Lieutenant Amy Brooks had been assigned to develop training programs for Allied forces who wanted to learn human tactical methods, but her sessions were producing mixed results. Species that had evolved as prey animals or social cooperators could understand human strategies intellectually, but implementing them required a mindset that most civilized beings found deeply disturbing. The humans trained for combat like they were preparing for extended hunting expeditions with emphasis on endurance and adaptability, and coordinated violence that treated individual survival as secondary to group success. Their military exercises involved scenarios that other species would consider atrocities, and their casualty projections assumed acceptable loss ratios that made galactic military planners physically ill. Admiral Jake Morrison remained as Earth's senior military representative, and his quiet competence was reassuring to galactic leaders who wanted to believe that human aggression could be channeled toward constructive purposes. His diplomatic meetings were models of professional courtesy, but everyone present understood that humanity was no longer asking for permission to do anything. The formal application for full Galactic Council membership arrived 6 months after. The war ended, and its language was carefully diplomatic while making clear that humanity considered their status as a probationary species to be concluded. They had proven their capability to defend civilized space, and their technology was advancing at rates that would soon make them equal to any galactic power. Zekth reviewed the application documents and found himself remembering his first meeting with Admiral Morrison and the way the human's smile had never quite reached his calculating eyes. The polite language and formal protocols couldn't disguise what humanity had become or what their presence meant for the existing galactic order. During his final official meeting with Morrison, Zekth asked the question that had haunted him since their first encounter. How long had humanity known that they were different from every other species in the galaxy? And what did they intend to do with capabilities that made them apex predators among civilizations that had evolved past the need for predatory behavior? Morrison's response was delivered with the same quiet intensity that had characterized every human interaction throughout the war. Humans had always known they were predators, and the question was not what they were capable of, but what they chose to do with those capabilities. They had chosen to defend civilization against the Void Hunters, but that choice would need to be made again every time humanity faced a threat or an opportunity. The conversation continued for several hours as Morrison explained humanity's perspective on their role in galactic civilization. They had no interest in conquering or ruling other species, but they would not accept subordinate status to beings who had proven incapable of defending themselves against serious threats. Humanity would be partners in galactic civilization, or they would be something else entirely. Zekth filed his final report as liaison officer and requested transfer to a research position far from the areas of space where human influence was expanding. He had fought beside humans during the darkest period in galactic history and had seen them save civilization from extinction, but he had also seen what they were capable of when survival was at stake. The day he had fought beside humans was indeed the day he had faced true terror, but not the terror of ancient machines that consumed entire worlds. The real terror was realizing that his species and all species now shared the galaxy with apex predators who had temporarily chosen to be allies rather than competitors. Humanity had proven they could be trusted to defend civilization, but the galaxy would need to learn how to coexist with beings who treated warfare as a natural function rather than a last resort. The humans were here to stay, and their presence would change everything about how galactic civilization understood itself and its place in a universe that was far more dangerous than anyone had realized.